Hey everyone, Sly here. Just want to talk a little bit about some of the attitudes in our communities around exclusion or inclusion of trans people and trans men and trans women in particular. Obviously I'm transmasculine in terms of my identity and my appearance, so I can only speak from that place and position. I'm non-binary trans, and I transitioned in the early 2000s when non-binary was not supported as an identity, and it certainly was erased nearly totally as a trans identity. And a lot of my work to claim space for my identity involved, confronting basically fear and confusion and a lack of understanding in my own communities, in my personal life, and in my professional work as a therapist and mental health worker. So, I've been doing a lot of space making for non-binariness and non-binary trans identities and trans masculinity for almost 20 years. And I've been through various iterations of community and community formations where transness has been viewed in particular ways, right? So early on in the early 2000s, you wouldn't really find trans women welcomed in and included in queer women's spaces. And at least in my local communities in Vancouver and Toronto. So, and there were very few trans men, at least visible and out trans men. Even there were very few online spaces, very, very few. There was like one forum that I was aware of in LiveJournal. YouTube wasn't even like a technology at that point. Around 2006, YouTube came in and trans guys started to become more visible and largely on YouTube and largely talking about their experiences of transition and whatnot. But I will say, during this time, the decade from 2000 to 2010, there was a lot of misunderstanding and erasure of non-binary identities and trans masculine identities. If you wanted to be seen as a legitimate trans person, you had to be very binary identified, and obviously, this is like sort of an inheritance of oppression that we've experienced because of psychiatry and how trans identities have been pathologized over many, many decades. But the binary mentality also played out in our communities with trans men or stealth F to M individuals, really very much excluding anyone who owned their assigned female histories, lesbian histories, butch histories, naming non-binariness as a thing and creating space for that. All of that was, in my experience anyways, kind of shunned and frowned upon and shamed. And, this is not something I'm making up, right? Like, this was real. There was no space for my identity, period, anywhere, not even in trans communities, okay? And to feel like and know that you are who you are as a non-binary person, and to even go or take tentative steps to find spaces that are so secluded and so stealth and so hidden, to try and make sense of and understand your experience, and then to find people shaming and castigating anything other than what they understand as like a binary male identity, for example, in trans spaces, was devastating and set my transition back a decade. Okay, I was transitioning, but I did not have access to medical care because the medical system was very binary focused, and also in trans communities it was considered faux pas to expand our understanding of gender. It was like, you were binary and that was that. And also because like trans people did not have that widespread access to medical care, and so even activists in communities, trans communities, were frowning upon me speaking out as a non-binary person around access to medical care. And this is legit what I experienced, right? And others too. But I guess I'm sort of painting this history to sort of situate where we are now, which is, in sort of being forward thinking around transfeminism and what that might mean as another iteration of feminist praxis in our communities, or feminism. You know, it's the idea that like transness is not excluded from queer women's spaces, or from queerness, or from queer men's spaces, or from the queer community in general, that trans women and femmes are centered, which is totally fine and lovely. But I don't see any analysis anywhere or any space for trans masculine or trans male voices to be centered and included. It's always, whenever we're talking about trans issues, trans men are completely erased in some, what I can only assume to be an effort to recenter trans femmes and trans women. But, you know, we should not be elevating trans women at the expense of trans men. You know, we are two separate categories of identity and groups of people, right? Diverse groups of people, lots of nuance in our identities in those different categories. But we should never be leveraged against each other when we're trying to tackle oppression, right? Trans women face an entirely different set of circumstances, especially racialized, especially Black, especially Indigenous trans women, than trans men. That is clear. Okay, trans men are pretty clear on that, it seems to me, right? If I'm looking at the posts of my peers in my community, we get it. We understand largely, you know, that we have more privilege in society, especially if we pass as pass as a binary male subject. If people read us that way, we definitely are subject to less trans-focused violence if we have those passing privileges, right? But, you know, we do not have spaces where we are uplifted. We do not have spaces where we are centered. The only spaces where I see trans men are a few people on Instagram. That's it, right? I don't see spaces where trans men can, or trans masculine people can be centered in our communities anywhere. We are not centered in queer women's spaces. This is, again, locally in Toronto. I'm not sure about anywhere else, but I've been here for the past 12 years now. There are no bars, no parties, no clubs, no apps, nothing. And we're misunderstood in queer spaces, in queer women's spaces, in queer men's spaces. We're totally misunderstood. I transitioned in, medically in the early part of the decade of 2010, right? And I was still completely misunderstood and erased, even by fellow non-binary people who were assigned female, who were my friends in community, even from other trans people, even from butch people, even from basically everyone. And I elaborated and did a lot of theorizing and expressing and disrupting around what it means to be non-binary, what it means to medically transition as a non-binary transmasculine person. And I think about now, 10, 12 years later, people are finally understanding who I am and what my identity is, even though I've been doing this work for 20 years. But I still have no community. I have no place where I'm elevated for my work, for my worth, for my identity in a group of people, for my work to disrupt masculinity and cis-hetero-patriarchal masculinity, for my work to uplift my community. I am nowhere, right? And that's erasure. That's all that is. The violence that I experience historically and currently in my life exists. It is real. I have experienced 6 on-the-spot death threats over the first 5 years of my transition. That wasn't about my male privilege, okay? That was about passing privilege, but also appearing to be a feminine person or a feminine man in some ways that were intolerable to cis-hetero men. But that is not ever accounted for in our discussions of violence, and I certainly don't feel included anywhere when trans people are talked about by especially cis queers in our communities. Cis queer assigned female people have a tendency to completely erase trans men as a sacrifice to this notion that cis-hetero patriarchy is evil, which it has been, obviously, But we should not be, as a group and class of people, excluded from transness and queerness because we identify with some form of masculinity, right? That is oppression. We are excluding trans men as if we don't exist because we are so opposed to the patriarchy. And trans men, no matter what work we have done to uplift others in our community, uplift femmes, uplift women, uplift ourselves, our peers, to reshape masculinity, we are still erased as if we don't exist. And that is violence. That is social violence. That is oppressive violence. That is a profound violence psychologically and socially that renders us isolated and lacking community, lacking friendships, lacking partnerships, and lacking support. Now, this might not be the case for other trans guys. That's fine. That's great. If you have it better than that, amazing. If you have community and you found and created that for yourself, amazing. But also consider, if you're younger than 30 and you transitioned, in the last 5 years, your privileges are a lot different than folks that transitioned before you. A lot different. So we might have totally different experiences, right? I'm just calling it as I see it. This is what I live with as an elder or an older person who had to transition when there was literally no one around to look to for mentorship and modeling, and no discourse, right? Creating a discourse, disseminating the discourse, no one understanding the discourse. I'm still here, and I'm sharing my point of view because I still live with those legacies of oppression every day. And I still see people posting and excluding trans men as if we don't exist. And that is violence. So I'm just sharing this food for thought, and I hope you take it to heart.